Funding for Frontline is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tonight on Frontline, one of the biggest toxic waste polluters in America, the U.S. military.
Unless they are caught red-handed, they have a sense of deniability that it's really not their problem, or the problem doesn't exist in the severity that we claim it is.
For decades, the Defense Department has dumped deadly chemicals into the ground, and people across America say they are the victims.
We have 23 cases of cancer, and I feel it's like a nightmare.
Tonight, poison and the Pentagon.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. Tonight, a report about the largest producer of toxic waste in America, the U.S. military. The Pentagon generates more toxic waste than the 5 largest American chemical companies combined. In the past 10 years, much of that waste has seeped into groundwater supplies near military installations across the country. That contaminated water could threaten the health of millions of Americans, and the government will have to spend billions of dollars to clean it up. But increasingly, there are charges that the Pentagon is doing a poor job of handling its toxic waste. Charges that the military is delaying cleanups and sometimes denying any responsibility for the contamination. Tonight's Frontline investigation examines 3 military toxic waste cases in detail. At an Army ammunition plant in Tennessee, a Navy air base in Florida, and an Air Force missile plant in Arizona. Our program was produced by Michael Kirk. It is called Poison and the Pentagon. It was reported by Michael Kirk and Joe Rosenblum.
This country lane in Jacksonville, Florida, is the site of one of the nation's worst toxic waste dumps. The homes here have been evacuated. This used to be a 7-acre swamp. Until in the mid-1960s, it was filled with garbage, including waste materials from 2 local naval bases, and the whole area was covered with topsoil. In 1969, after the dump was filled in, a young couple began building their dream house here on Hips Road. Yvonne and Don Woodman built their house with their own hands, raised their children here, and over the next 17 years became part of a small neighborhood.
My husband and I were both raised in small towns, and that was the first thing that struck us as nice because it was small town. Neighbors were extremely friendly. They were dependable. They cared about one another. They still do.
City water was not available at Hips Road, so the neighbors drilled their own wells. They had lived there only a few years before noticing problems with their water.
My wife and I, she noticed it first. She said, "You notice a different taste in the water." And I said, "I can smell it, but I really can't taste it because we'd always have cold water, you know, and I couldn't taste it that way, but I could smell it, especially when I take a shower. And when you take a shower in that house, it'd smell up the whole house."
What did it taste like, Carolyn? Do you remember?
It was almost like a metallic, almost a gasoline oil base, something like that. It had a real weird taste to it.
You'd wash your clothes the very best you knew how, and they got dingier every wash. And I tried everything, you know, bleach and all the old home remedies and everything, and it got worse and worse and worse.
Residents notified the state authorities, and the water was tested in 1983. Contaminated water notices were posted on their front doors. Their wells were closed, and for 6 months, bottled water was brought in. Tests showed their wells had 20 hazardous chemicals, 7 of them cancer-causing. Once their worst fears were confirmed, the neighbors began to look for someone to blame. Because local people remembered the Navy's involvement in the Hips Road landfill, they appealed to a powerful local congressman, Charles Bennett. Bennett asked the Navy about Hips Road. In this reply to Bennett, the Navy, 5 months after the water was shut off at Hips Road, said, quote, "The Navy did not dump at the Hips Road site, nor did we contract for disposal of materials that caused contamination at the site." Yvonne Woodman and her neighbors were stunned because this contradicted clear evidence of the Navy in their own backyards.
Tools brand new, never been used, still in the case, throw them away.
Leaking cans of solvent, paint thinners and that sort of thing,
Oh, yeah.
Different types of cleaners, either half opened or not opened, some crushed, some with just, no more than a screwdriver hole in them. And some of them you'd pull out and they'd still be dripping. I mean, it's not anything that anybody today can go out with a shovel and just unearth just as much of the stuff you want to haul away.
Over the years, everything has surfaced. This has not been touched. This is an aircraft tire. And all of this stuff is surfacing as the sand is blown or the erosion takes place or whatever. All the materials are surfacing to the top. It's very easy to find stuff out here.
Here is part of a fuselage right here, wing of an aircraft right there.
There's a can of 1,1,1 trichloroethane. This is microfilm that Mr. Vorp found as he was laying the foundation to his house. And we enlarged one of the legible ones, which shows an aircraft.
Arlington residents took a fight to City Hall tonight. Hips Road residents took their fight to Washington. Hips Road residents
The Navy's denials and the discovery of leftover Navy material in her backyard caused Yvonne Woodman, high school graduate and housewife, to become a self-taught environmentalist and organizer, testifying before congressional committees and trying to get Hips Road cleaned up.
I was raised to respect the American government, and I love America. I'm proud to be an American citizen. My husband was in the Navy. My son is now in the Navy. I've never been a radical. I've never gone out and laid in front of a bulldozer. I've never done any of that stuff.
Woodman's faith in the Navy has been shaken by her experience. After 5 years, the Navy still maintains that none of its toxic waste ever went to Hips Road.
Room Papa 495. Can you leave room to allow another aircraft to get by you at the end, sir?
493,
Thank you.
Are we cleared to land?
The Jacksonville Naval Air Station is one of the Navy's largest bases for maintaining and overhauling aircraft. Since World War II, this installation has routinely used large quantities of toxic chemicals.
Room Papa 495. Continue right over.
Chemicals to dissolve the grease off engine parts, chemicals to strip paint, chemicals for various purposes like methylene chloride, trichloroethane, and ethylbenzene. Scientists say in very small quantities the toxins may not be that dangerous, but apparently over the years thousands of gallons were just taken off the base and haphazardly buried.
Naval Air Station Jacksonville is a big industrial station. They probably use every chemical known to man in some way or another. And routinely they would dump it into the ground.
The story of how the Navy handled its toxic waste begins in the mid-1960s. It is told by retired base employees.
My job was to dig a great big ditch, 20 foot deep and 24 foot wide, and burn this garbage on top of the ground. The trucks would dump it right up on top of the ground. I would burn it, run over it with a bulldozer, mash it down as flat as I could get it, then push it into that hole and cover it up with a couple of feet of earth.
For 20 years, Roy Durham buried toxic waste for the Navy at the Jacksonville base itself. His friend John Austin is also retired from the Navy.
At a later date, they were fast running out of dump space, so they contracted with a private contractor to remove it from the base.
For years, little attention was paid to what happened to these chemicals and whether they made their way into dumpsters like these. In 1966, the Navy contracted with a company then called Waste Control of Florida to remove the dumpsters. The Navy says policing the dumpsters wasn't its responsibility. It says that was the job of men like Charlie Evans. 20 years ago, Evans was a waste control driver at the Navy base.
Go ahead.
Do you ever look inside these things to see what's in there?
No, you really don't have time. You know, you really don't have time. And it's something that most of us drivers not even interested in doing. The only thing I can remember at the base in particular was those long plastic tubing pipes. I don't know what they were or what they was for. If it's smoking, then I feel like it's some kind of acid. But it's hard to tell dust from smoke in these trucks because you run up with a lot of.
Starting in 1966, the waste was trucked from the base to local landfills. The chief lawyer for the Chicago corporation that acquired Waste Control is Jim Hines.
This was the normal way at that time to do it. You would contract with either the city to use it as a landfill or with a private company to use it as landfill. And after about a year or however long it would take to fill it and level it off, then the homeowners would now have level ground in the back instead of a swamp full of mosquitoes.
20 years later, the garbage company now regrets that practice. The Navy, however, has never publicly admitted its waste is at Hips Road. But the Navy's former civilian supervisor of waste disposal at the Jacksonville base told producer Michael Kirk that it was possible toxins got in the dumpsters. Henry Foster.
Ground space. I don't think anybody would deliberately throw that sort of hazardous material into a dumpster. But again, we did not police the dumpsters. We just emptied them.
You actually remember times, though, when there were 55-gallon drums in there and other things that were not just leftover waste stuff from an office?
Well, it has happened. I couldn't remember specific instances, but that was common practice that anything you didn't want, throw in a trash container.
So it's not only conceivable, it's probable that a lot of stuff got into those dumpsters that wasn't supposed to be there. Liquid stuff, solvent strippers, paint thinners, degreasers, everything else.
It's conceivable, yes.
But in its contract with the garbage company, the Navy promised not to throw any hazardous material in the dumpsters. The garbage company's lawyer, Jim Hines.
Well, I think that Waste Control of Florida, again, a small local hauler at the time, was contracting to take out garbage. And if there's anything that was non-garbage, non-conforming to the contract, then, you know, the Navy should have had better control.
Once it went through the gates, it became somebody else's responsibility. We made sure that they didn't dump it on the station site. They didn't spill it on the station site. Dumpster dumped on schedule. Where they went with it was not our responsibility.
But in 1985, the Environmental Protection Agency refused to let the Navy and the company avoid responsibility by blaming each other. The EPA determined that both the Navy and the company were responsible and might have to pay millions of dollars to clean up Hips Road. In an extraordinary action, 6 Hips Road families were then evacuated and relocated.
Well, this is the old homestead. To say what it's done to the neighborhood, I think it's obvious. It looks like a ghost town now. It has totally devastated us emotionally, physically, and economically. The house has been vandalized in the past 2 to 3 weeks since it became public that all of the people were moved out. And that hurts. We left it spotless when we moved out in December. It's not just the kitchen, it's the whole house. They've got the cabinets, they've got the carpeting. I even had drapes. I left drapes up. They've just demolished it. It hurts. Hurts bad.
Worse even, the Hips Road neighbors believe their health has been seriously damaged. They complain about a spectrum of illnesses from headaches to cancer and deaths. Woodman herself says she suffers from an immunity disorder called lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. Those illnesses and the other alleged effects of the Navy's toxic waste are the subject of a lawsuit filed by Woodman and 150 others. Again, through the entire 5 years, the Navy has refused to even talk to the people of Hips Road.
That's the idiocracy of this whole thing, is people out there are saying they're experiencing it, they're living these nightmares, and these people that have been exposed to chemicals are saying this is happening to us, and they're not listening. That, I think, is the ultimate insult to people.
Perhaps the only time the neighbors will hear from the Navy will be in court. The Navy also declined Frontline's repeated requests for an interview. But we did find the Navy's Chief Environmental Officer, Commander Richard Rice, at an open congressional hearing. Frontline's Joe Rosenblum asked why the Navy wouldn't speak publicly.
Whose decision was it that you wouldn't cooperate on an interview, do you know?
I don't have a response for that.
Is that your decision?
I don't have a response for that. I mean, it's not there.
The military has seldom had to respond to questions about its environmental actions. And although the Pentagon itself has projected that it will cost at least $15 billion to clean up military toxic waste, they have yet to account publicly for how and where the money will be spent. Congress occasionally holds hearings, but it was only in the last year that the Pentagon had to give up responsibility for monitoring its own cleanup and come under the scrutiny of the agency in the federal government that is supposed to protect people like Yvonne Woodman. The EPA is charged with ensuring that the military now lives up to the nation's environmental laws. And the head of hazardous waste enforcement here is Gene Lucero.
The military actually, when you compare them with other federal agencies and you compare them with some private industry, has been pretty responsible.
So let's give them a grade. Let's give them an academic grade, A, B, C, D. Where were they when they started, and where are they now?
5 years ago, I think the military probably started out in the D or F area. That's pretty subjective, and I don't think anybody tried to measure it. I think if you had to give them a grade, they've moved up into the high C, low B area. If you wanted to look at everybody all together, there are a couple of instances where they've done some decent work. The single instance might warrant an A. They've done a decent job. They've talked to the community. They have the states pretty happy.
Where?
I'd have to say it's probably some of the smaller facilities.
Where?
I would have to say, my sense, and probably. Well, it's hard because I don't know all of the facilities. I'd have to say I think they've done a decent job at Pensacola and perhaps at a couple other Navy bases. At the same time,
So far, the Pentagon has located 3,700 toxic sites on military bases. After more than 12 years, it says 207 are cleaned up. Congress's Bipartisan General Accounting Office says only 99 are. But the EPA has yet to certify any as complete. The military insists there have been successful cleanups. They say one of their notable success stories is in West Tennessee. The Milan Army Arsenal, 80 miles from Memphis. Since World War II, millions of tons of ammunition have been assembled here. The process of making ammunition uses explosives like TNT and RDX.
At this point, we've pressed approximately 30.5 grams of Comp A5 explosive in each grenade box.
And at least one of the byproducts of this process, dinitro toluene, or DNT, causes cancer in animals, according to the EPA. This is some of the plant's toxic waste. For 40 years, it flowed into 11 man-made lagoons the size of a football field. The lagoons became a poisonous swamp. For decades, no one paid attention to them. But then, in 1978, Army investigators found that the toxins in this water had seeped into the underground aquifer, or porous rock, that supplies the plant's drinking water. For decades, the people who lived here in base housing and thousands of workers had been drinking polluted water. The Arsenal's environmental officer, Pat Brew.
That was a shock, definitely. That's an understatement. It was a very shock to the installation. We took immediate action to protect our people.
Drinking water wells were immediately shut down. The base commander was notified.
On my part, there was a concern that we had a problem. We didn't know where it was coming from at that time. We weren't really sure what the extent of the problem was.
Jim Knipp was commander at the Arsenal for 2 years. During his second year, the pollution was discovered. He remembers the Army brass's initial reaction.
Shortly after it occurred, they were concerned about the publicity. It was decided that we would have a press release, and it was a lot of last-minute script changing to be sure it was just exactly what it should be, and it was blessed at all levels of the Army, up to the Department of the Army levels in Washington. I had a full colonel down here from Washington to be present during this. Sort of in the background, I had, even the day of the press release, I had to get approvals. I had the script, and they were checking to be sure the script was exactly right.
This is the Army's 1979 press release about the contamination. It contains no clear warning to the thousands of workers and residents the Army knew must have been drinking a cancer-causing chemical for years. Milan, Tennessee, where many of those workers live, is just 2 miles from the Arsenal. This small city of 8,000 depends on the Arsenal for jobs. There is a sense of calm here about the contamination. Many citizens trust the Army to tell them the truth. Local newspaper editor Bob Parkins.
I think you have to have faith in the United States government. And I'm satisfied with what they're doing and what they're trying to do. And I don't believe we'll ever have that problem in Milan.
The week the Army announced the contamination, the Milan Mirror Exchange had other stories to cover.
Major soil saving effort. County jail problem. We've built a new jail, which just opened this week. And a local beauty, Miss Milan Cajun, occupied the front page.
And where did Parkins put the story about the poisoning of the Arsenal's water supply?
Right there.
Page 13. And this is the story. It is word for word the Army press release. Soon afterwards, Colonel Knipp left Milan for his next assignment near Washington, D.C. Then, 1 year later, he retired and moved back to Milan to live.
I had found out when I was away from Washington and talking to the people who had been involved in the initial stages of defining the problem that nothing seemed to be happening. They didn't seem to be concerned. Well, there's not much happening at Milan was the approach. And I thought, well, gee, there should be. I came down here and I see the open ponds still sitting there. Now, we knew at that time, first thing you do in a problem of this sort is stop the water from running into the pond because it was creating a hydrostatic pressure to force the chemicals down into the aquifer. The pond stayed there. They were quite visible. And no action was taken to cap them.
Surprised?
Yes, I was surprised. And at that point I thought, well, now look, people ought to be aware of it, and hopefully a public pressure would make them do something.
In June of 1983, nearly 3 years after the discovery, Knipp wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper. It insisted, quote, the Army stop fumbling with this time bomb and block the flow of poison into the water table. The next day, NIP's disclosures were front-page news across Tennessee. This is where the polluted lagoons used to be. And this is a drawing of what the pollution looked like. It seeped into the underground water supply. After NIP blew the whistle, the Army finally decided to clean this up. They followed the 3-year-old recommendations of their engineers and employed the cheapest solution. They drained the lagoons. They filled them with 15 feet of clay, gravel, topsoil, and grass, a solution known as a cap. The Arsenal's environmental director.
You really only had two options. You encapsulate your contaminants like this to protect it, and it is here, not going anywhere, or you had an option to dig it up and then take it somewhere else and bury it or treat it. This, in this case, was the most economic and the best approach at this point in time.
Some independent engineers and environmental experts say the Army's solution is only a half measure. They argue the Army's cap does nothing about the pollution still underground.
All they did was stop the motion. I believe they took the best actions that we know how to do today to keep the problem from continuing to migrate to the aquifer. But the toxins still exist somewhere, and they need to be taken out.
Doing that would cost millions more. The contaminated soil would have to be dug up and incinerated, and the polluted water pumped up, cleaned, and pumped back into the ground. The Army says that's not necessary, even though it now faces another setback. Despite the cap, in the summer of 1987, the EPA placed the Milan Arsenal high on the Superfund list as one of America's most hazardous waste dumps. The Army's response has been a campaign both locally and in Washington to change the EPA's determination. The current base commander says he wants off the list.
Why is it so important to get off the list to you, Colonel?
Well, because it's bad publicity. It's as simple as that. Every time this list from year to year surfaces, the news media comes out, and it's bad publicity for the plant.
Bad PR, yeah, I don't like bad PR, but if you got a problem, then the way to get good PR is to correct the problem. Think what good press you'd get if the Army were really actively cleaning up this problem.
No one is certain how much toxic waste is under the base, or whether it will move toward the city of Milan and private wells in the area. But both the Army and its critics agree that if the toxins do migrate, they could pose a health hazard that would expose the military to massive lawsuits. And that's exactly what has happened here. Tucson, Arizona. The 600,000 residents of this desert city rely entirely on underground supplies for their drinking water. This neighborhood is known as the South Side. More than 1,000 of its residents are in court. They say their water has been poisoned. The source, they say, lies about 2 miles from the South Side neighborhood. They contend a cancer-causing chemical from this Air Force plant has polluted their water. The plant is operated under government contract by the Hughes Aircraft Company. The story behind the case is a complicated one. It goes back to the mid-50s when toxic waste from the plant was pumped into the desert. The South Side residents say it seeped underground, entered the aquifer, and flowed into their wells. People who grew up in the neighborhood drank that water for much of their lives. Melinda Gonzalez went to high school here in the mid-1960s, and so did her future husband, Rick. Melinda now teaches school in the neighborhood, and Rick is a lawyer. About 10 years ago, they became concerned for their friends.
It seems like a lot of times we would hear a story. Someone would say, oh, did you know that so-and-so now has a brain tumor? Did you know that someone died of leukemia?
And the list became endless, and it came to the point that we started keeping a list because there were so many people.
They were people in our age group, which really concerned me.
I got to the point where my wife and I concluded that there had to be something unusual about this neighborhood since it was always our friends.
It wasn't until the wells were closed in 1981, and when I'll never forget getting the paper that morning and seeing it in the headlines and thinking, this has to be it. This has to have some connection to what we've been seeing, what's been going on in the community.
So Rick filed a lawsuit on behalf of their friends and hundreds of other residents. Hughes and later the Air Force were named. This community's drinking water wells had levels of trichloroethylene, TCE, as high as 200 parts per billion. The Arizona standard is 5 parts per billion in drinking water. In 1985, the EPA identified TCE as a probable cause of human cancer. Studies are continuing, but while scientists debate TCE's toxic effects, many in this neighborhood have already made up their minds.
I was starting to notice some changes. I would walk down the hallway and I'd bump my head on the walls. My balance was just really bad. People would tell me, "What's wrong with your voice? You know, you're talking funny." But I didn't notice any difference.
Barbara Valenzuela grew up in the neighborhood. She went to Sunnyside High in the late 60s and early 70s.
Well, when he told me, it was like a shock. You know, this isn't happening to me. I told him, "What are you talking about?"
Valenzuela has had 3 non-cancerous brain tumors removed. She is partially paralyzed and deaf.
I think what I miss the most is not being able to hear my kids talk.
No doctor can directly link water pollution to Valenzuela's problems, but she makes sure her family only drinks purified water, and she still worries about them.
I would hate for them to be sick, for anything like this to happen to them. And still, when they complain of a headache or an earache or anything like that, I'll rush them to the doctor, but it scares me.
And Barbara Valenzuela isn't alone in her fears. Some who live on this street say they have every reason to be afraid.
We have 23 cases of cancer, and I feel it's like a nightmare. On this house, a friend of mine died with cancer, and there's skin cancer on this house.
I have cancer, thyroid cancer, and my mother she had breast cancer. And the people who lived there before us, the mother and the daughter had cancer also.
Sharon Flowers and Marie Sosa's claim has never been supported by a physician, but they're still taking no chances.
And I've only given her bottled water. I've never given her tap water. Which is expensive, but I don't want her to drink the tap water.
A 1987 University of Arizona study showed an abnormal number of heart defects among children born to parents who were exposed to TCE in this neighborhood.
She's been in the hospital 3 times since July 21st, which it's been a lot in the last 2-3 months. The leukemia it's brought her down a lot. Her mood's changed, and she's not the same little girl that she was 2 months ago.
Christina Tellez is 2 years old. Her mother, Elisa, grew up on the South Side. Christina has leukemia and was born with a heart valve defect.
I think that's too much for one little girl to have to go through. They tell us that it's clean water, that we're safe for now, but I don't think they even know that for sure.
You don't trust them?
No.
How come?
If they let this go on for this many years, how can you trust them now?
Elisa is one of the residents who are suing Hughes and the Air Force.
You're bringing the right people.
You sure are. We're on purpose.
Pete Lopez is another. He is the former president of the Hughes Machinists Union. Lopez is drumming up support for the lawsuit among retired Hughes workers.
Any of you are sick and still want to get into that class action suit, you get a hold of me and I'll give you the lawyers' names. You can still get in on the class action suit.
Lopez believes the drinking water at the plant killed his wife, who worked there. She died of cancer in 1984. He is always on the lookout for witnesses to the toxic dumping.
Contamination of the water that we drank all those years, say.
I remember all that shit, but I was there. So was he, so was he. But many, many times went down there and we drained that degreasing tank.
Yeah.
And sometimes we run it in the cellar on the floor. Then we'd get in there and tear out the heaters, and then we'd wash that all out, and it all went in the sewer. Every goddamn bit of that.
Yeah.
The Air Force and Hughes deny that they contaminated the South Side's drinking water. Robert Morrison is the senior executive at Hughes responsible for toxic waste. He's been here for 20 years.
It was not carelessness or ignorance. It was an accepted fact back in those days that no one knew of the dangers, and everyone did the same thing. Hughes was no different than, as I'm sure as you've been finding out, anyone else across the country. There was TCE dumped on the ground. We don't know how much. We have pretty good estimates. Not very many gallons, really.
Nonetheless, in 1981, tests showed TCE levels at 10,000 parts per billion in the groundwater, one of the largest concentrations ever found under a military installation.
Everyone was quite shocked at what was found. No one really had any idea that there was any contamination underlying the plant site.
But the history of this plant tells a different story. Almost from the day in 1951 when Hughes started operations on the desert next to this then sleepy western town, the company began receiving toxic waste warnings. This State Health Department document, written in 1952 and sent to Hughes, said, quote, "The problem is serious as it concerns the water supply of a large number of people. It is therefore recommended that a constant check be maintained." And many other official records from as far back as the 1950s detail other complaints. Some former Hughes workers, like Pete Lopez, remember their fears about the toxic waste back in the 50s.
I used to go out at dinner time to, take a walk. And when we walked down, there was a little road along this ditch that they kept cleaned off. And you go down there and, boy, it smelled bad. Because they dumped all their chemicals in this ditch. All the chemicals come out and dumped in this ditch. Now, at the end of the ditch, it tapered off, and it formed like a little lake at that part of the desert.
Lopez says vast quantities of waste flowed from the Hughes plant into the surrounding desert. He even remembers the time the wastes apparently killed cattle on a nearby Indian reservation.
No, we can't get the ditch. This here is the bridge. Here's the little wash where the water run through right here on this bridge. The water run under this bridge, went over in there, and over in there, that was where the cattle was dead. Over in that area, over in there where that tree is, beyond that tree is where it flowed down through there. The fence is right there. The Indian reservation fence is right there. And that's where the cattle were dead, 3 cows over there.
Lopez says the wastes that flowed down the ditch also went into large holding ponds, and that some concentrated waste was collected into open pits on Hughes' property. And a 1985 State Health Department report confirms this. It says Hughes poured wastes into open pits and ponds until the mid-1970s.
Never, to my knowledge, have we ever did use ever, to my knowledge now, since '69, did we ever drain any solvents to the desert through the waste stream.
Through the waste stream, in some other way.
They were dumped in a couple of different pits.
So they were dumped in pits.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In large quantities.
Small quantities, in my judgment. Well, might be large in some people's judgment.
Well, what quantities are we talking about?
I can't remember the numbers, but it's.
Talking about thousands of gallons, are we not?
I would say in the low thousands.
So it wasn't correct what you said before when you said that solvents, after you came here in '69, that solvents were no longer.
They were not dumped in down the ditches. They were never dumped in the ponds and the waste streams.
So instead of going into the ditches, they went into pits.
They went into pits.
Yeah, but these are unlined pits.
Right.
Has it not been determined since then that indeed the solvents dumped into the pits also went down into the groundwater?
Some of them did, yeah.
Yeah, some of them did.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this then is the issue. Did Hughes dump thousands of gallons of waste into open pits and ponds? And did that pollution enter the groundwater and seep into the south side? The state report says, quote, full-strength liquids were disposed of in pits and ponds from 1952 until the mid-1970s. And the state report cites further evidence that Hughes' handling of toxic waste was casual, if not careless. But Morrison says the state is wrong.
This report is wrong, then.
That's what I'm saying.
It's wrong. The Arizona Department of Health Services is wrong in its report, what it says here.
That's what I just said.
All right.
This man says Morrison is wrong on another point. He was Hughes' water consultant for 20 years.
You solemnly swear the testimony you will give at this deposition will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
This is the sworn testimony of Leonard Halpenny. It was videotaped as part of the Southside residents' lawsuit.
Do you recall being again contacted by Hughes in 1979?
Yes, I do.
And who contacted you on this occasion?
Well, I'd have to look at the letter that resulted from that. Mr. Robert Morrison.
Okay. And what?
Morrison had him taken to a spot in the desert at the Hughes plant Halpenny had never seen before, a toxic waste dump.
And I became deeply disturbed. I asked what they were. And among them was paint, crankcase oil, and other liquids that needed disposition. After I finished that meeting, I came home to my office, and I had, in my opinion, a crisis of conscience. My crisis of conscience was that here was something that had been going on for 20 years or so that I never knew about till that day. I didn't know what was being dumped into the pond. I was concerned that something that might have been dumped into the pond might have been hazardous in some manner, that I had not been informed about it. So I resigned. My letter of August 24, 1979 constitutes a resignation, and I didn't even send a bill.
Do you know why that was, that he was no longer willing to work for Hughes Aircraft?
I don't have any idea.
Well, let's read the letter then that he wrote to you.
Halpenny's letter says he not only felt misled by Hughes, but that two other toxic ponds he had known about had never been cleaned up as he recommended. Morrison says they were cleaned up.
So your consultant was wrong in what he's saying.
He erred in when he wrote the letter. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
While Hughes argued over the details of the disposal of their toxins, the Air Force itself decided to initiate its own investigation. Routinely, the small Air Force staff at the plant has to rely on out-of-town Air Force personnel for environmental expertise.
Haven't seen you in quite a while.
Based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, they watch over environmental matters at this and 12 other plants. Colonel Peter Rupert is a former cargo pilot recently assigned to the Environmental Division.
Air quality regulations that are being proposed in the House right now and in Congress.
Charles Alford has degrees in public administration and psychology. His Air Force title is Environmental Program Manager.
In the waste minimization studies, where we're trying to look at all the emissions from all the chemicals used throughout the plant.
Alford visits Hughes 4 times a year, but only a few days at a time.
You know, Bob, if the federal facilities are specially treated under those
Both
regulations.
Alfred and Rupert say they have confidence in their relationship with Hughes, and especially with Morrison. The Air Force's 1982 investigation also had to rely on meetings with Hughes personnel and with its own in-plant Air Force staff. In this report, obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, the Air Force plant commander at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Grant Hurd, is paraphrased as saying that Hughes had acted responsibly in disposing of its wastes. This is Lieutenant Colonel Hurd in 1983. In another document, Hurd reports that Hughes' practice always had been to recycle its TCE rather than dump it in the desert.
With you.
At the end of its investigation, the Air Force decided to absolve Hughes of financial responsibility and decided to pay for the cleanup themselves, a cost to the taxpayers of at least $30 million. 1 year later, Colonel Hurd left the Air Force to take an executive position at Hughes in Tucson. Congress later passed a law which would have prevented this kind of revolving door activity, but Colonel Hurd, while refusing to grant Frontline an interview, denied on the telephone any conflict of interest. The Air Force not only agreed to pay for the cleanup, but also awarded Hughes the multi-million-dollar contract to clean up its own waste. Morrison was put in charge. What he built was a state-of-the-art facility to clean up the toxic waste. Wells are sunk into the underground pollution. It is pumped up and monitored by these computers. After it is run through these filter tanks, it is sent back into the ground. In the past, the pollution that was dumped in the desert flowed north towards Tucson, while some pollution came from sources like the airport. By 1985, the EPA had estimated that the pollution covered a 4-square-mile area and that most of it came from Hughes. But Hughes and the Air Force say they only contributed 1/3 of the pollution, and it stops at this highway. The highway borders the south side. So the chances of the south side residents getting a state-of-the-art facility to clean up their groundwater depends on the outcome of a long bureaucratic battle between the Air Force and the EPA, leaving a lot of residents still angry about why they think it happened in the first place.
Well, I think probably out of greed, because they sure in heck knew that those chemicals weren't any good to go into the ground like that or go into the air. People breathing it, it was no good. I think that they must have known and just didn't give a damn. I don't know what else.
If in Tucson the Air Force was only willing to clean up a portion of the toxic waste, then how much the Pentagon will be willing to do at thousands of other places will depend on how much money and how high a priority they are willing to assign this issue. In Washington, there is at least one congressman who has held hearings on this subject and is increasingly frustrated by the military's performance. Congressman Mike Sinar is a Democrat from Oklahoma.
Nice haircut, Ted.
Boy, you don't know how close you came.
New carpet in here? Hello, Michael. Hey, guys. Is this where we're getting briefed? All right.
Sinar's subcommittee is preparing to take the military to task.
Hey, Robert, how are you?
You know, Jake.
Yeah. Well, regrettably, this is what we've found in almost every military operation that we've looked at, whether it be the Air Force, the Navy, or the Army, is that we're almost looking at it facility by facility to get the military to respond. Unless they are caught red-handed, they have a sense of deniability that it's really not their problem, that they've contracted it out, or the problem doesn't exist in the severity that we claim it is.
Sinar has decided he has no alternative but to call the military into a hearing room and demand some answers. He's been hammering away on this for 5 years. Today, all the top military environmental officials are in the hearing room.
The subcommittee will come to order. Our original investigations and hearings indicated that there were serious problems in DoD's hazardous waste programs. Our purpose today will be to determine how much progress, if any, has been made in solving these problems.
The hearing has drawn a full house.
The testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do. Thank you very much.
The chief representatives of the Army, Navy, Defense Logistics, the Air Force, and an Undersecretary of Defense, Carl Schaefer.
From 1984.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Schaefer. Are we going to clean these up in my lifetime or your lifetime?
The good Lord willing, we certainly will. This is not easy. And the issues that
my friend, may be the greatest understatement that we have in this whole hearing and in the last 5 years.
We want to fix it, and we want it to be right. And at the same time, we are not recalcitrants, and we are not anti-environment. We are, on the contrary, determined to get these problems identified and fixed.
But for Sinar, the issue is not just the military's accountability.
All right, let's go to another site, Air Force Plant number 44, Tucson, Arizona. Now, in 1981...
But also the Pentagon's relationship to its private defense contractors.
I'm from Muskogee, Oklahoma. Mr. and Mrs. Smith live on 14th Street, Muskogee, Oklahoma. What they're going to read tomorrow about Tucson is this. They're going to read that Hughes Aircraft improperly disposed of hazardous waste that they were under contract to with the Air Force. But the Air Force has decided that they're going to pay for it. Not only are they going to pay for it, they're going to pay them a profit for it. And so Hughes Aircraft is not being slapped on the wrist, is not being held accountable like Mr. and Mrs. Smith on 14th Street may be if they dump something in their backyard, or some company in Muskogee. And what am I going to tell them? Why there are two sets of standards, one for private industry and one for the public? I mean, what am I going to tell them? What do you want me to tell them?
I can't answer that. I'm not qualified to answer the question in
Mr.
terms
Schaefer,
of the
what am I gonna
contractual
tell them?
relationship between the Department of the Air Force and Hughes.
What am I going to tell them, Mr. Schaefer? I mean, I think this is crazy. Here we have a company that improperly disposed of hazardous waste that now we're going to pay them plus a profit to clean it up.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you're involved in a very difficult procurement arrangement on these contracts.
I don't care what the difficulty of the procurement arrangement is. I'm asking you something different than that. I'm asking you why private industry is held liable and Hughes Aircraft isn't.
Well, that's a good question of liability.
All right, in the 1983 report again, Mr. Rice, it says that Paradise Island landfill, there is, quote, an estimated 7.8 million gallons of waste. When are you going to decide whether that site needs restoration, Mr. Rice?
Sir, each of those sites was contained in a Phase 1 study. All of those are progressing through the RIFS process. None of them are listed as remedial action yet because we have not determined what the appropriate action is.
When?
I do not know, sir. Sir, I will have to provide that for the record also.
According to your October 30th update, you're also still studying sites 12, 13, and 14, and that the 83 Phase 1 report says that, quote, the tanks have been leaking for more than a decade. There are ongoing contaminations of groundwater by dissolved fuel. There are thousands of gallons of fuel oil floating in the water table, unquote. When are you going to proceed on that cleanup, Mr. Rice?
Sir, I do not have specifics on that site either.
Okay, White Oaks Lab. Who's going to answer that one? Who's in charge of that one?
It is a naval facility, sir.
Can you answer anything about that one?
No, sir.
Did you tell these other guys to be prepared? Did you all meet?
Sir, we did meet, and there are so many areas of interest that it's difficult to know what to be up to speed on in such.
Well, you got one Air Force, one Navy, one Army, and where are you from?
Defense Logistics.
Defense Logistics. I mean, if each one takes their individual category and the sites within the potential sites that we've been talking to you about, it seems like everybody could be prepared, don't you think, Mr. Schaefer? I'm not trying to be tough, but I mean, you know, I don't want to have to bounce you in here every month. I mean, the reason we have these hearings is to do it now and not to have to come back over and over and over again. Let me go on. The Inspector General report states, quote, fragmented policies, lack of effective structured management, lack of communication at all levels. Nearly every installation commander and staff visited indicated that they believed that they were not receiving adequate guidance and support, unquote.
Last month in Tucson, the Environmental Protection Agency, acting on a tip, discovered a barrel apparently containing toxic waste from the Hughes missile plant dumped in the city landfill. Hughes had always denied that it was dumping any waste there. After the inspection, Hughes environmental officer Robert Morrison was suspended from his duties at the plant, pending further investigation of the dumping. In Tennessee, despite the Army's protests, the Milan ammunition plant remains on the EPA's Superfund list of the most dangerous toxic waste sites. And in Jacksonville, Florida, there is still no sign of a settlement between the Navy and the people who lived on Hips Road. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
Next week on Frontline, the intensely personal agony of incest.
I can't remember when it all started. Dad making me look at dirty pictures, touching me.
One woman confronts her past.
Why didn't you leave him?
I thought maybe he would straighten out.
Watch To a Safer Place on Frontline.
Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Frontline was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Educational organizations may inquire about videocassettes by calling 1-800-424-7963.